At the cemetery, a funeral is being held for a teenage boy. His classmates place flowers on the closed casket while the family grieves deeply. Meanwhile, inside the coffin, the boy is alive and unharmed, playing on his phone. Darren leads a typical life. He is well liked by his peers, excels in school, makes his parents proud, and has a wide circle of friends. However, one person doesn't quite fit into his structured life: his best friend Steve. Steve invites Darren to skip history class, and although hesitant, Darren agrees. Steve then dares Darren to break the school's lantern, which results in Darren getting reprimanded by both his teacher and parents. At home, Darren's mother scolds him harshly and forbids him from continuing his friendship with Steve. His father shares the sentiment, believing Steve is a bad influence. According to his parents, the ideal future involves a prestigious college, a stable job, and starting a family. Darren is overwhelmed by this vision of college, work, and family repeating in his mind. He realizes he doesn't want this path, but he doesn't challenge his parents. The following day, Darren tells Steve they have to keep their friendship a secret so as not to upset his parents. Steve is outraged and accuses Darren of being spineless. Their argument is cut short when a vintage car with the word "Fate" on the license plate passes by. A man throws a flyer out of the window which lands at Darren's feet. The flyer turns out to be an invitation to a freak show. The friends want to attend, but Darren has been grounded for 2 months. However, that night, Darren sneaks out of his house and joins Steve at the circus. The friends arrive at an old theater and notice a blood-red moon in the sky. Steve is excited since he is obsessed with vampires, while Darren is more interested in spiders. They purchase tickets from a little freak and enter the hall. The show begins. The host of the show, who has a large, unusually shaped head, introduces the Wolfman. With a growl, the Wolfman approaches a woman in the audience, and moments later, bites off her arm. The woman screams and the audience panics. The Wolfman flees, but the woman with the missing arm calmly walks onto the stage. Her arm quickly regenerates since she is the queen of regeneration. Next, the skeletal Alexander takes the stage. He has no skin and no internal organs in his abdomen. Other acts follow, including a woman with enormous teeth and a man with 2 stomachs who can digest anything. A snake-skinned man named Evra performs, followed by the stunning Madame Truska. She invites Darren to assist her on stage. With a mere touch from Darren, the woman grows a beard and the audience bursts into applause. Madame Truska gazes into Darren's eyes, sensing a dark future ahead. After her is a magician named Larton Crepsley, accompanied by his spider, Madame Octa. Crepsley dramatically flies onto the stage and Darren, entranced, can't take his eyes off the spider. Madame Octa's bite is deadly, but Crepsley controls her using a flute. Suddenly, Steve informs Darren that Crepsley is a real vampire, as his picture appears in one of Steve's vampire books. Meanwhile, Crepsley releases Madame Octa into the audience and she lands on Darren's leg. Crepsley calmly retrieves the spider and tells Darren that vampires don't exist, but if anyone did know about them, they would be strangled in their sleep. The performance is abruptly interrupted when a group protesting against the freak storms the hall. Amidst the chaos, Darren sneaks backstage. He finds Crepsley's dressing room and enters, captivated by Madame Octa. But there is a coffin inside. Darren approaches the cage, admiring the spider, and plays the flute for her. Suddenly, voices can be heard approaching the door. Darren quickly grabs the cage, shoves it into his bag, and hides in a closet. Crepsley and his friend Gavner enter the room. Their conversation reveals that they are vampires. They discuss how their friend was recently killed by their enemies, the ruthless Vampanese. The two also mention the return of the mysterious Mr. Tiny from another realm. Gavner believes Tiny sees himself as the judge of fate and intends to wipe out the vampires using the Vampanese. Gavner is eager to fight the Vampanese and avenge their friend's death. Crepsley refuses, adamantly against going to war. At that moment, Steve barges into the dressing room, fully convinced that Crepsley and Gavner are vampires. Steve asks to be transformed into a vampire as well. Crepsley warns him that becoming a vampire means leaving behind family and friends, making it a poor decision. However, Steve insists, citing his troubled family life and demanding to be turned. Crepsley tastes Steve's blood, but immediately spits it out. Steve's blood is bad, and he can't become a vampire. Steve threatens the vampires with violence, but the two men quickly throw him out of the dressing room. Darren, who's been hiding in the closet this entire time, seizes the moment to escape. He runs out, only to be picked up by a black car right in front of Crepsley. Inside the car are Mr. Tiny and one of the Vampanese. Darren jumps out near his house and runs off. The next day, Darren heads to school, opens his locker, and admires Octa. Steve walks up and notices the spider, realizing that Darren had been in Crepsley's dressing room and overheard everything. Just then, the bell rings, and in shock, Steve drops Octa's cage. The door opens, and the spider escapes into the crowded hallway filled with students. Steve, grabbing a broom, shoves everyone aside, determined to kill the spider. Darren, desperate to save Octa, chases after Steve. Sensing danger, Octa bites Steve on the cheek, knocking him unconscious, and then scurries away. Panicking, Darren seeks Crepsley's help to save his dying friend, but Crepsley calls him a petty thief and refuses to assist for free. Crepsley realizes Darren is in serious danger from Mr. Tiny. He then offers Darren a deal. He'll turn Darren into a half-vampire and make him his assistant in exchange for protecting him from Tiny and saving Steve. Darren is hesitant about killing people. Crepsley reassures him that it's the Vampanese who kill, not vampires. Crepsley conducts the blood exchange ritual, and Darren collapses, feeling cold. He's now a half-vampire. Darren leaps onto Crepsley's back and they fly to the hospital to give Steve the antidote. Steve's pulse begins to stabilize. Darren tries to push Crepsley away. Soon, Steve recovers and returns to school, while Darren starts craving raw meat. He also begins feeling an urge for blood, nearly attacking his sister. Crepsley appears in his room, informing Darren that he must now leave his family. To do so, they need to fake his death. Darren says goodbye to his family without revealing the truth, trying not to alarm them. Darren and Crepsley sit on the roof together, when suddenly, Crepsley distracts Darren and snaps his neck. Darren is unable to move, though still alive. It's time to stage his death. Crepsley tosses Darren off the roof and vanishes. Everyone believes Darren is truly dead. Steve approaches his friend's coffin and places a phone in Darren's hand, noticing his vampire claws. Steve now views Darren as a traitor. Later that night, Crepsley returns to the cemetery and digs Darren out of his grave. As Darren emerges, a Vampanese named Merlot drops down from a tree in the graveyard. Merlot lunges at Crepsley, and a vicious fight breaks out. They destroy tombstones as they battle, eventually tumbling into Darren's grave. Crepsley shields Darren, trying to protect him from Merlot's attack. Crepsley knocks him out with a shovel and throws Darren out of the grave. Fortunately, Crepsley and Darren manage to escape from the cemetery by flying away, but Murloc gives chase. Crepsley heads toward the road and sets things up so Murloc gets hit by a car. Crepsley meets with the circus leader Toll and requests that Darren be allowed to stay since Tiny is after him. Meanwhile, Darren meets a girl named Rebecca, and together they eavesdrop on the conversation. Toll agrees to let Darren stay, provided he contributes to the camp. Darren will share a tent with Evra, a guy with snake-like skin. Darren promises not to drink Evra's blood. Meanwhile, Steve continues attending school. He can't stop thinking about Darren and eventually decides to take his own life. However, Tiny intervenes just in time and reveals that Darren is still alive, but has become a vampire and betrayed him. Tiny, claiming his powers are limitless, offers Steve the role of his assistant, which Steve accepts. During a discussion with Toll and Crepsley, Tiny announces that a war between the vampires and the Vampanese is imminent. According to prophecy, 2 young men will lead this war. Tiny demands that Darren be handed over to him, but Toll asks for time to consider. The next day, Darren and Rebecca grow closer as they spend time together. Rebecca admits that she is part monkey and even has a tail, but Darren is unfazed by this. That evening, Crepsley begins teaching Darren how to fight as a vampire, understanding the looming danger. However, Darren is weak because he refuses to drink blood, a situation Crepsley intends to correct. Meanwhile, the Vampanese welcome Steve into their ranks. Steve successfully completes it. His first victim as a Vampanese is his history teacher. Crepsley explains to Darren that there's no need to kill people. Vampires can put their victims to sleep using their breath, drink a little blood, and leave them unharmed. When they wake up, they won't remember a thing. The refusal to kill is what separates vampires from the Vampanese. One night, the Vampanese stormed the Freak camp, searching for Darren. Darren is too weak to defend himself, but Crepsley comes to his rescue, hiding him inside a coffin. The Freaks manage to fend off the Vampanese, but they kidnap Rebecca and warn Darren that he should return home. Later, Darren finds himself back at his old house, but no one is there. Tiny and Steve have abducted his family. Darren realizes his loved ones are being held at the old theater. At the theater, Murloc confronts Darren. He's tied up Darren's family and Rebecca. Steve soon arrives and brags about the people he's already killed, taking pleasure in it. Steve offers Darren a deal: kill Rebecca and drink her blood, and in return, his family will be freed. Afterward, Darren must join the Vampanese. Darren firmly refuses, but just then Crepsley arrives at the theater. Mr. Tiny watches with amusement but doesn't interfere. Using her tail, Rebecca frees herself from the ropes and rushes to Darren's side. She urges him to drink her blood, but Darren hesitates, fearing he will lose his humanity. Rebecca convinces him to take the plunge, and he drinks her blood. As the fight between Crepsley and Murloc intensifies, Steve jumps into the fray and stabs Crepsley with a silver knife. Darren, now empowered by the blood, steps in and attacks Steve. At the same time, Crepsley takes the knife and plunges it into Murloc's heart. With his final breath, Murloc declares that the war is now inevitable. Tiny is delighted by the events and thanks everyone involved. But Darren believes the war won't start if no one finds out what happened. So he confronts. Former friends are now enemies, but Darren can't bring himself to kill Steve. Tiny steps in and effortlessly separates them. He tells them that this isn't the time for them to fight to the death. The final battle has already been foretold, and it will come later. Darren gives Steve one last chance to return to the light, but Steve refuses. Tiny then drains Murloc's soul from his body. Tiny and Steve leave. Crepsley hypnotizes Darren's parents so they won't remember the events of the night. As Darren leaves, he finally kisses Rebecca, something he's dreamed of for a long time. The friends return to the camp, where the majority agrees to let Darren stay. However, Gavner later visits Crepsley and tells him that it's time for the three of them to head to the vampires. Darren, unaware of this, is happy with how things have turned out.